This is Medieval Middle Eastern Ceramics, and this lecture is about the Iranian stone paste bodied wares, primarily luster wares, but related wares as well. So, at about the time that stone paste and luster pigment was introduced back into Asia from Africa, from Egypt, this part of the world was somewhat, it's not like directly ruled in often cases, but certainly there was a single political entity to some degree for this entire region because of the Seljuks. The Seljuks are what this type of pottery is often named after. It's often called Seljuk pottery. And some of it is actually much later than the Seljuks, but we all call it Seljuk pottery, as being that pottery made in Iran between, say, 1050 or so, up until the Mongol conquest in 1221, which is some years after the last Seljuk Sultan. But their capital, certainly under Malik Shah, was Isfahan, which is quite important, as you will come to know. Because here is Isfahan. This is another Google Earth image. Often if you see, I want to see what old Isfahan looks like, and you'll see a red circle around this area. But a recent paper trying to better understand the boundaries of earlier medieval Isfahan make it this big, up to this ancient Sasanian fortress, and including this area here, which was later completely obliterated in the 17th century by the Safavids. And so, there's not actually much evidence around here for the earlier medieval city, but this probably did include it at that time. So in the Great Mosque, the Friday Mosque, there were excavations relatively recently, and in the foundation trenches of this domed hall dated 1086-1087 was found pottery like this. There are a number of them, it's not a stray piece, and if you have been looking carefully at the pottery drawings, you will recognize the way the shape of this vessel and the way that the foot ring sort of sticks out at an angle a bit. And this is closely related to the Talmanese style of lusterware made in Syria. So this is actually, when this was first published, was the first confirmation of what was previously considered my rather early dating of Talmanese to as early as 1075. And so here you can see there is the Talmanese style. In fact, the slight incurving is more like later Talmanese wares, so the dating would be really quite perfect for being 1086, 1087 for this piece of pottery related to my Talmanese style. So that's quite important, but also here it is in Iran, and this is probably not Talmanese. It could be, but I doubt it is. It's probably an Iranian pottery made under the Seljuks in Iran, possibly Isfahan itself. I haven't thin sectioned any of this pottery, or it could be made somewhere else. There are a number of centres making stone paste bodied wares, and since this isn't a lusterware, we don't have that to help us decide. But certainly here we have just the thing for showing the beginnings of stone paste production in Iran. So another important city, and if you remember the last lecture, it's one of those that was a very important city, very large city in the earlier medieval period, and then was completely obliterated by the Mongols. And so then they moved somewhere else. In this case, the ancient medieval city of Rai was replaced eventually by the modern city of Tehran. This is the extent of 19th century Tehran, in fact. But Rai was a very important city in the early medieval period, and being, again, basically a ruined field, there is lots of places for people to go and dig up stuff. So there are a lot of things coming out of the ground at Ray in earlier times. This one, you see that this is a British Museum object acquired in 1891, so it goes quite far back. So this, at that stage, was thought to be evidence of manufacture of lusterware at Ray. And you can see it is a lusterware. Indeed, it is a lusterware. And there are broken pieces of pottery that are fused to the inside of the vessel during the firing. Now, there are two issues with this being identified as a waster, as actual evidence that there was lusterware production at Ray. Now, one of these is that this is probably what we call a closed vessel, like a vase or a bottle or something like that. So these fragments, you would hardly be aware of them if they were in the bottom of a finished vessel. So if you had like a nice lusterware vessel and you look down the neck through the hole in the top sort of thing, you might be able, you might not be able to see it, but you could possibly see these down there, but you really wouldn't be that bothered by it because, you know, it's a beautiful thing and it's not there for you to be peering down the hole at it. So it isn't necessarily proof that this is a waster. None of these breaks have glaze on them, which would suggest it happened in the kiln. This vessel was existed and was broken. But the biggest argument that it's not a waster is, in fact, this would have happened during the main firing. Now, if you remember the lecture where I introduced lusterware, you will know that the luster paint is applied in a later low-temperature firing. So the vessel would be completely fired and would be a finished vessel in every way, and then the luster paint is applied to the finished vessel, and it's heated up to a high enough temperature for the glaze to become sufficiently molten that the metals will fuse to the surface. If it becomes significantly molten, then all of the luster pigment will fuse to the surface, not just the metals. So this would have been in the main firing. You can see the glaze is completely molten. This is in no way something that could have happened during the luster firing. So this vessel, and you can see the broken pieces are actually blue, whereas the vessel itself is white. And it's possible that parts of it had a bit of blue paint, but this really seems to be a blue vessel that broke possibly during the firing. Fragments of it fell down into this vessel, and when it came out, they thought, well, it's not that bad. It's got a few bits stuck inside, but it's a closed vessel. I'm sure it'd be worth painting and going through the second firing to fix the luster paint to it. So, although for many years this was thought to be evidence of manufacture at Ray, it's not. So this actually is evidence for manufacture at Ray. It's a waster. You can see this is clearly a number of vessels which got fused together in the kiln during the firing and were discarded because it's no good to anybody. It's not even a second or anything. A second is a piece of pottery which is not completely ruined. It's like not perfect, and those are often called seconds. This is not a second. This is a waster. This is completely ruined, and you can see the breaks happened in the kiln, and it's a total mess. So this was found at Ray. In fact, it was excavated at Ray from a team from the University of Philadelphia, and they excavated here to try and find all of these things that the clandestine excavators were finding. I really don't know what the little tick down here. It's starting to annoy me. And this is what it looks like. And the fabric is stone paste, of course, because that's what I'm talking about, and it is made up of very clear quartz with sand grains. So this is a sand, but some of the rounded grains have carbonate affixed to the outside. So this is probably a sandstone, which had where the sand grains had been sort of fused together by carbonate in between to make it into a rock. So this is probably a crushed sandstone. It might even be the local geology of the Ray area. So that's what the pottery made at Ray looks like. Here is another group of pottery. I call this the Ray 3 petrofabric because of all the fabrics found at Ray. The first one I identified was probably the waster. That was Ray 1, but that's actually just Ray. Ray 2 was probably the lusterwares, which actually has an identification, which I shall come to. And so this is Ray 3. I don't know where it's made. It is made of finely ground, very clear quartz, and so it is not geologically very distinct from the Ray fabric. This could actually be made in Ray. All they needed to do was grind the sandstone further, and you would end up with very clear quartz like this. So I would rather it had evidence, like we found later wasters that look like this, that have this fabric, but it's possible that this is also made at Ray, or it's possible it's made somewhere else. When you have a limited distinguishing features in the fabric, you can only say so much. So either, but certainly distinguished from the next group very easily. Okay, this is actually the same thing in thin section, lots of quartz. And so these are some examples, very old photograph, as you can see, of pottery from the Ray excavations. So there's a lot of lusterwares, different styles, and this is an enamel painted, overglaze painted type called Mediaeval quite often. And this is the fabric that I find in lusterwares. This is, and it's Kashan, it says it right here, so I'm not giving anything away, it's right there. So this fabric is very unusual, it's quite unique. You can't mistake it for any other fabric. It's one of those things that, oh yeah, well, this is obviously this place, wherever it is. And this is all chert. So if you're aware of what chert is, it's micro or cryptocrystalline quartz. So this is a macrocrystalline quartz. You see it's one big crystal of quartz. This is very, very fine quartz. And it develops in limestone. It's a sedimentary rock. So this is what chert is. Or flint, or something like this. So what this is at first, this is what all lusterwares are, and all the Mediawares that I've sampled are of this fabric. And so how you ascribe it to Kashan comes next. And that is because the only evidence for where lusterwares are made are inscriptions. And here's an example of that. This is a vessel made in Kashan, it says it right on it, by a chap called Muhammad al-Nishapuri. And of course, it is staggering to think that some people later than this was made, have argued, oh, well, clearly they were making lusterwares in Nishapur. No, they were making people called Muhammad in Nishapur, who then went to Kashan to make the lusterwares. It's possible he learned the lusterware technique in Kashan. That's what that means. He's from Nishapur. He's from Nishapur, not that the pottery is from Nishapur. So there are a number of vessels which say they're made in Kashan, and this is the only evidence for where lusterwares are produced. So we have evidence that some styles of lusterware, because not all styles have inscriptions and not every vessel has made in Kashan written on it, but we have evidence that certain lusterwares are certainly made in Kashan, and we have the petrographic analysis which shows that all lusterwares of whatever style are made in the same place. And so that one place must be Kashan. It's really quite logical. And that's also true of midnight wares. So here's a nice midnight ware for you to look at. I'll talk more about midnight wares when we get to them chronologically. So here is a map of Iran, and there's one other little thing I want to mention about Kushan. Here is Isfahan, often the capital, and here is Kushan, right there. There's Ray, near Tehran. There is Nishapur, snuck in there, and Jurjan, which I may mention, or have mentioned in the last lecture, I think. And on this map, you can see there are these cities, important cities, and also there is this major Shia shrine at Qom. There are a number of other major Shia shrines, but this is probably the biggest. And another interesting thing are the Ismaili Nizari castles, which I identified them all and put them onto Google Earth. It's a lot of fun. So you can see there's a lot of Shia people in Iran at this time. In fact, Kashan in particular was known as a Shia center. So again, this is the Seljuks. This chap, Nizam al-Mulk, describes the Kashani as entirely these things, Rathizi and Sabi, which apparently means Ismailis. And he says their leaders are magicians, which of course is a translation, so I have no idea actually what he actually said, but magicians might mean that they are, in fact, Zoroastrians, but I suspect it's not a complimentary term. But basically, Kashan is Kashan is known as being a Shia center in this period in Iran. So what I was saying previously about the possibility that the luster potters were in fact Shia, possibly Ismaili, that would work very well in this case. But let's get back to the pottery, or in fact the motifs on the pottery. So again, lots of motifs and lots of dates. And so again, this forms into distinct groups. Some groups more distinct than others, as you should come to find out. In fact, you'll find that out right now. Here we have the chronology of those groups. There's the first one, which looks kind of Egyptian, then the second one. And so these first four are just sort of evenly divided into 25-year periods, going from things that look like they were made after potters came from Egypt or possibly from Syria, and go up to things which start having dates on it, which is useful. And also the forms will relate to the archaeological evidence we have for the pottery in Syria and Egypt, of course, because they always seem to be making the same forms wherever they are. And then you get after 1200, you have this group. Okay, so this might be because I went crazy because there is so much available published material, because lusterwares in this period were really fine art, and a lot of them are published and they're very beautiful, and so you can really start dismembering them and splitting them in probably more than I should have done. And so I actually call this spiral inside supergroup, as you should come find out what, basically between 1200 and about 1260. And by now you may have noticed Group X, which I shall explain more fully towards the end of the lecture, but there is a Group X. And then we settle down to Group 8, Group 9, and Group 10, with a lot of dating that really helps work that out. Again, 25 or 30-year periods. So going back to the motifs, if we look at a couple of examples, here's one with this script back. You might remember in Syria we had a reverse that started off being related to some sort of script and then changed. There was the very early ones which had S shapes on them that looked like they were derived from scripts, and then the X backs, the other backs that look like they could be related to scripts. But this one really, although it is gobbledygook, I believe, really looks like script. So they probably had the same source of influence. And there are other motifs, of course, and so that would collectively date this vessel to about here. And of course, this is partly based on what order I put the motifs in, so I wouldn't necessarily say I'm dating this precisely, but it gives you an idea of how this works. Here's another one. This is a diagnostic of an entire group. This knot back group, I call it the knot back group because it has these things that remind me of diagrams I saw when I was a Boy Scout telling me how to tie knots. I was in the Sea Scouts, and tying knots was very important. Although I'd have to say I wasn't in the Scouts, I was in the Cubs because I got thrown out as being a disruption and never got to be a scout because they're all losers. Not to disrespect scouts in any way, but that's what I thought at the time. So, and so this is a broader group for this. This one actually has two different motifs from two different periods. So you think, oh, well, that makes it nonsense then. But what happens if you look, here's the knotback, and here is a diagnostic motif from the succeeding group, which is a checker tree. And so that would suggest it's made about here. And so you are going to have things which are part one group and part in another, because if it is actually a continuous production, and there's no reason in this case to doubt that the production was continuous in this period, because this is the period that the Seljuks were running things and everything was largely hunky-dory. There are no wars, apart from messing around with crusaders in the west and that sort of thing. So the production probably was continuous throughout this time. And here's a much later example made in the 13th century. So, yeah. So now I'm going to show you some of these groups and go through them chronologically. This is the first group. This is the Egyptianizing style. This is the sort of thing that some people might say, oh, is that Fatimid? Or no, is that Egyptian? Or no, maybe it's Iranian. But I believe this one is Iranian. There's a number of clues which would suggest it. And so this would be an Iranian, some of the first Iranian lusterwares, I believe, would be strongly influenced by the Egyptian pottery. Here's another one, and you can see it actually does look rather like calligraphy, although it's actually gobbledygook, I am told. And so here are some of the forms, and these broad dishes are very typical, and these other vessels, which are hard to define as being hemispherical or just sort of weird. And this style continues, these broad dishes, but you can see there are differences, clearly distinct differences in the rim. You can see it gets there is a broader rim, and other forms come in, like clearly what you might want to describe as a hemispherical shape here. And so you can see the forms changing through time along with the with the motifs changing. And here is one of those hemispherical bowls, and you can see the calligraphy is becoming completely rubbish now. Here are the forms of groups 3 and 4. So this is the 3rd and 4th quarter of the 12th century. Here's the knotback group, or the knot group, with a K. And here you can see a proto-biconical bowl, which would have been made at this time in Iran and Syria and Egypt. And of course made in other materials. You get glass that looks like this, and you get metal that looks like this. So all these media would have had the same influence and would be making the same forms. And here we have, this is the descendant of those broad dishes. You can see that the rim has become broader and broader. And this you might look at and you think of the date. So we're talking about 1150 to 1175, 1175 to 1200. So this would be contemporary with very similar forms we see in Egypt and in Syria. So yeah, same forms, different places. Here's an example of one of those knockback groups. This is actually a Rom piece. That's really one of our nicer pieces. Here's a very elaborate knot. That'll definitely keep your boat up, tied up against the wharf, I think. And here is Minai, because it's at about this time that they come in, somewhere between 1175 and 1200. Most of them seem to be made in the 1180s. That's from the Rom. Just thought I'd tell you. So here you can see this thing. So these are dates of luster vessels. These are dates of luster tiles. Objects with dates on them. These are minai. These are underglaze painted, and these are monochrome, which I don't talk a lot about, but they were made. But as you can see, when you're painting things, you're more, and very proud of them because they're lusterwares, you're more likely to put dates on them. So the minai wares, there's a couple that show up later, which are somewhat wobbly in their attribution, but there are a number of dated ones of this period, and the forms of minai wares almost all fit precisely into this period. They're contemporary with the group 4 forms of lusterwares. There's no early ones, and there's very few later ones. They're mostly made here. Now, the technology, being an overglaze painted technique, is actually not advanced. This is probably an overglaze painted technology dating back to the 8th century in Iraq. But it has been suggested by some people that the polychrome paint is influential on Syrian polychrome painted wares. Only the Syrian wares are underglaze painted, whereas the Iranian wares of this time are overglaze painted. And it's interesting to understand why people thought that the Syrians copied the Iranians making polychrome painted wares. And the interesting thing is that that I believe that is not true, and in fact it's very much not true, because but it's interesting to try and understand why people would think that. And I think one of the reasons people think that is because most of the people that say things like that are art historians, and there's far more art in minai than there is in underglaze painted wares. They are very beautiful objects. Art historians love them, and so they will say, well, this is far more beautiful, so therefore this less beautiful. And I'd have to say, this is quite a beautiful example of Syrian underglaze painted ware. The less beautiful underglaze painted wares from Syria are clearly derivative of the Iranian wares. This is really not very fair as a fundamental reasoning. And if you're aware of the archaeological data, you'll be aware that minai is incredibly rare in the archaeological record. Up until relatively recently, I was only aware of a handful of minai fragments actually from archaeological contexts. Over the years, more and more have been published or got dug up, but still, it's not very many. And the number of underglaze painted wares made in Syria and then traded around to Egypt and Europe and the rest of the Middle East is very large. It was a very large production of ceramics. There were a lot of them. And so, yes, some of them are kind of mass-produced and not very pretty. Some of them, like this one, were beautiful. And so it's unfair, I think, to look at how pretty it was to say that this was which way the influence went. And in fact, when you work out the dating, the Syrian underglaze painted wares are much earlier than the This is like the polychrome ware, starting in about 1100 and continuing really all the way up. But there is some overlap, and there are some motifs you see on the underglazed painted wares in Syria and on the Minai wares. But the overwhelming majority of them are up to 75 years earlier than the overglazed painted Minai wares. So if there is an influence, it is certainly the other way around. The Iranians saw this beautiful polychrome painted pottery, and for a while then it actually became more important, more common, and I would say more beautiful. I mean, as an archaeologist, I would say beautiful, meaning they put more time into producing it. It was very fastidious and fiddly, and so that is also making it beautiful. So beautiful as an archaeological term is talking about man hours quite often, and that's what it would be in this case. And so what they did in Kashan was in fact make polychrome painted pottery by using a very old technique, overglaze painting. And so that's what actually happened, I would say. And it's one of those things where I would say, but you know, I know I'm right. So there. So this, did I miss one? No. So this is actually an SEM image of a Minai ware, and this is a blue paint, and the blue paint is actually in-glaze painting. So in-glaze painting is when you paint on the glaze before you fire it. And so they have a vessel which has the white tin-opacified glaze on it, and then they paint on it with a cobalt pigment, a blue cobalt pigment. Well, it's blue after the firing, and that, as you can see, has sunk into the glaze, and this is called in-glaze. This, however, is a black pigment and a white pigment, and you can see they have not sunk into the glaze. This is chromium, and this is tin oxide, and so these would be the enamel painting, the overglaze painting applications, and so this would have been done in a later firing to fuse those paints to the surface. So you can see why art historians love this ware, that has a complete narrative on it. And you can see the blue and some other colors, I think the turquoise as well, would have been in glaze. They'd have been painted onto the unfired vessel and would have sunk slightly into the surface and be slightly ill-defined around the margins. But then everything's cleaned up with nice black lines, and other paints would be overglaze and would require a second firing. Possibly even more than one firing. Jury's still out on that. Again, with the same motifs and the same forms as we find on the lusterwares. This is shows you the sort of narrative, and I think the reason Minai wares typically are so beautiful is because this is actually a lot of work. If you remember underglaze painted wares, you just basically you have a vessel, you form the vessel, you paint it with the paint, you put the glaze on it, you fire it, you're done. It's actually a very economical way of making pottery, and so sometimes you might not want to make it very beautiful. But with Minai, you have all this fiddly. You have different pigments, you have different firings in order to create the design. You have to make sure you put the turquoise bits and the blue bits in the right place, because then you're going to want to put the other bits on later, and everything is kind of fiddly and will be making this vessel cost a lot of money to produce. And so you're going to want to spend the man hours to get that money back. And so typically you will be making beautiful pottery. It's just necessary, otherwise you don't make any money out of it. And so you make beautiful pottery that is worth a lot. And they have, it's very good for narrative scenes. This is a chap from Iranian mytho-history, shall we say, Bahram Gur. and his girlfriend Azada, who was a harpist. And this is considered a great romantic story amongst Iranians to this day. And what happened is Azada, well, let's go to the next one. So here's Azada again. I told you, it's very popular. And so basically, he's this great archer, and she is saying, if you're such a great archer, you can pin that gazelle's foot to his ear, and you can change the gender of a female and the change of a male. And so she keeps giving him all these challenges, and he gets so tired of this, he knocks her off his camel and tramples her to death. This is not my idea of a romantic story, but for the Iranians it was. They seem to keep making the same story time and time again. So go figure. See, there she is in two places at once. So this is a particularly narrative piece. This is again from the great Iranian mytho-history called the Shahnameh, and has two characters called Bijan and Maniza on it. So this would be great for, like, you're sitting around, because there weren't televisions, there wasn't, you know, anything to amuse you, and so what you would do is tell stories to each other and make up stories and make up poems or read old poems. And so I actually have proposed in a paper that this is why there is so much of this on Iranian pottery at this time, that there are so much imagery. And so if you're having a dinner party, and you know, these lasted for some time, and you run out of poems, you run out of stories, and you look at your cup and you think, remember Bijan and Manija? And there you go, you're reminded of another story. Of course, it can also be used to illustrate it if you're telling that story over lunch. Here's Feridun, again from the Shahnameh. This is a major battle, which is not from mytho-history, but actually from history. And you can see they've got all these horse archers. So there's a classic example of how Seljuks did their warfare, horse archers, you see. So at about this time, in the late 12th century, they also made this in Iran. It's known as silhouette ware. And it has been suggested by some that this is an early attempt at underglaze painting. But it's actually much later than underglaze painting in Syria. And it's not really underglaze painting. It's really, this is an SEM picture of one of these. And you can see that the whiter bits here are chromium, and the darker bits are quartz. And so this is a stone paste body, of course, and the decoration is really a slip, because it has a medium of quartz, basically the same as the body, and the pigment, which is chromium. And so this pigment is applied to the outside. And so again, this is actually a very old technique in Iran. It's slip painting, and then you have an alkali glaze over it. And so this is not a predecessor of underglaze painted ware, which had been made in Syria for about 75 years by now. It's an attempt by Iranians to make painted pottery using a very old-fashioned technique. So this is the lusterwares made in this last quarter of the 12th century. This is the Checkertree group. And you do get, so, you know, there is a bit of script going on here, but it's completely random. The Checkertree is what is one of the most common motifs of this group. And here so that could also date this very nice bovid. And here we have the same motifs, and of course all these other motifs help build up the assemblage of motifs which date the vessel. And this chap's probably also about this period. This one is interesting. It has possibly the earliest evidence we have of the Kashan potters incising the luster paint. So we've seen this elsewhere in Telmanis and other places, where in Egypt, where they have painted an area with the luster paint, and then scratched through the luster paint to create the design or refine the design. But what they are doing here is sort of making the background, the field of the design, a bit lighter by putting these little scrolls in it. And this is not quite like the later ones, but this becomes the style of the next groups. I say groups because there seem to be 3 of them, all roughly made at about the same time. So this supergroup, shall we say, dating in the first quarter or so of the 13th century, so about 1200 to 1225. The forms include, in fact dominated according to this illustration, true biconical bowls. So again, the same biconical bowl form as made in Syria and Egypt at this time, and also found in glass and metalwork from around the Middle East. Here is the latest version of the broad dish with flat rim. It's very, very broad and not very distinct from the main vessel. So this is probably the most dateable group here. There's lots of dates on this, and lots of inscriptions as well by artists. So it's quite an important group. I still haven't got around to explaining why there's a group X. Here is group 5 with distinctive motifs. So here's the spiral infilling. So it's like the one I just showed you, but it's a lot finer, and they do a lot more scrolling on the little spirals. But also other motifs become distinct, like this reverse is very common, and these little birds, and the way they do the leaves. How they do the leaves is very diagnostic. And of course they're getting very much into writing. And so what they will write, of course, I've already told you, they will do things like say, someone or other made this vessel in Kashan, and of such and such a date. So they were keen on doing that in this period. But also they would have things like poems, which goes back to this idea of mine that the vessels were very useful during dinner parties. And if you had run out of poems, all you had to do was look down at the table, and there on a plate would be the first line of a poem, which of course you knew by heart. And so you'd say, remember this poem, and you would say this poem, and everyone would say how lovely it was, and have a nice time. And here you can see that same motif. You can see it went all the way around, and they didn't have room to do it properly again, but it's fine. This one is unusual, well, not very, because I think the next one's the same, in having the scrolling not as being incised, but painted, so that's a lot more like the Syrian examples made at Raqqa. As it's not that unusual, because here's another one. And so as I say, in this period, they really took a lot of care, and there were some beautiful things done before, but they're really going crazy, making the beauty of this object. It's sort of like this just this roundel, but it's so even in its texturing, but it also has a man playing polo on it, on a horse. It's remarkable. And this is interesting. This is one of a later application of the overglaze painting technique. Although in this case these may be inglaze, although the black is probably overglaze. But the blue and the turquoise are typically inglaze, and then the luster paint, and you can see again those little birds and the same leaves as in that previous one are applied later. Here's another very beautiful plate recounting a tale. And in here, I sometimes, when I give lectures on tattoos, I look, she's got something wrapped around her arm that might be a tattoo. Who knows? And of course, we now have underglaze painted, true underglaze painted wares with just pigment under the glaze. And so some of them may be made in Kashan. These kind of look like they are because they have all the motifs and everything. But until you thin section, you can't really be certain. This again looks like it has the same motifs you would get on lusterwares, but again, you don't know, they're not copying them. But the beauty of these faces, so well painted with single strokes, would make me think it's made by the same people that made those lusterwares. Could be wrong. But you had all sorts of other underglaze painted wares. This is a very distinctive style. So production in other centres would have continued through the Seljuk period. So then we get to the Ilkhanid period, groups 8, 9, and 10. And so here we have what is actually the last expression of that flat-rimmed dish. You can barely see any difference between the rim and the side of the vessel now. And you still have the biconical bowls. But you start getting these introduced. These are direct copies of imports from China of the Yuan dynasty. And so these become so dominant that in the succeeding group, all of the vessels are copying Chinese imports. They have these hemispherical bowls, and they have these broad dishes with a little turn up at the end, directly copying the imports in this era of Celadon, which of course we shall talk more about later. And this is the only one I'd drawn of group 10 at this time. And so this is basically the same sort of thing. So this, since so many of these have dates on it and that sort of thing, it actually is very useful in dating the time that imports of Yuan Celadon completely swamped any local traditions of forming. And so if you find vessels that look like this, you know they will be dating from about this period. So here's a group 8. You see that the way they do the painted field is different. I call it the earmuffs because they're often little earmuffs. Sort of like scribble at the end, then go around, and there's another one. Looks like an earmuff. You have to admit that looks like an earmuff. And we get a lot of tiles. The most commonly dated objects in this period are tiles. This one's signed by Ali ibn Muhammad ibn Abi Tahir. Very well-known chap. This one's at the ROM. This is the dot fill group now. Group 9. Because they don't have it, hardly any scribbling. Okay, there's an earmuff. But most of them are just like dots. They just do a little bit of scribbling in there. They sort of, it's really not as attractive, but they think they know what they're doing. And certainly, I can't make a nice pot like that, so I'm not going to be critical. And here's a group 9 example, probably that one in that drawing, in fact, with the diagnostic motifs of the period. And here's the same motif, so it's probably the same date. And here is, again, an example of that very strong influence from China in the form, although the decoration is entirely the traditions of Kashan continuing. And here's another one of that Ilkhanid period. This is the technology of Minai with the overglaze painting, but you don't call this Minai. You call this Minai, so this is actually referring now to the fact this is one of the signed and dated pieces. And you have to admit, that is a very attractive vessel. So, as I was saying, these things are very popular. And when we have our lab, I'll show you some of the pastiches we have at the ROM, where they have taken fragments of these, found in clandestine excavations, and glued them all together to make new vessels. And so a lot of the vessels that are out there in museums are not actually as they were made. This one looks kind of okay, but a lot of them, it's very difficult to tell. Certainly very difficult to tell from photograph, but some of them are actually difficult to tell even looking at them, because the thing about an overglaze painted vessel is it's very easy to overglaze paint it today to make it look like something it's not. And so it's harder with a lusterware to have a large area of plaster which you then paint to look like luster, for it to look like luster, because it will never look like luster unless it's luster. Whereas the overglaze paints could actually look a bit like, say, an oil paint or something like that that's painted on the surface. It's a bit shiny and on the surface and so that sort of thing. So it's very easy to make rather dodgy examples of this. But this one hopefully is okay, because it's made by this chap called Abu Zaid, and it's dated to 1187. So, and that wasn't supposed to happen. So, this is where we talk more about this thing with all of the things and all of the dates. I said these are luster painted vessels, luster painted tiles, minai, underglaze painted in monochrome vessels. And here are the artists who made or painted the pottery, probably painted at least. And when you look at them, some of them clearly are distinct, but some of them look like they might be related. These ones possibly are talking about a continuous sequence of potters. Here's Yusuf, son of Ali. Here is Ali, who's the son of Muhammad. Here's Muhammad, and going back. And so it is possible that what we're looking at, possibly going back to the beginnings of lusterware production, is a single family or a number of related families, or some degree of relatedness going on here. Because, you know, you're not going to share your secrets with anybody else. You're going to train your own children to understand the technology of Stonepaste, of tin-opacified glazes, of lusterwares, of all of these things. And you will want to pass them on within the family. And you will have people joining the family. I remember my hypothesis about the beginnings of figural art in Fatimid Egypt, that perhaps one of the local lads, possibly originally a Copt, but a painter, might have been married into the family and started making pottery. So the idea that there is some sort of familial descent going on seems to be suggested here, and it's the sort of thing you do see in other places. So it's not an irrational observation that there may be some familial descent, although you also have these other chaps like Abu Zaid who really signed a lot of things. All these other chaps, and here's Muhammad ibn Muhammad al-Nishapuri, our friend from Nishapur, and so maybe he came and married into this family and started making lusterware pottery. It's somewhat conjectural, but still it's also perfectly reasonable from what we know about craft industries and guilds and things like this. So that's one observation from this. Another is this Group X. Isn't that exciting? Group X. So why is there Group X? You've been wanting to know that since I first mentioned it, haven't you? Well, you see, when I first did all this looking at motifs, I created my sequence. And I thought, well, I think these might be overlapping. But largely, they were sequential. And then I put them all down, and I realized there's one missing. And the reason it's missing is because they weren't making pottery in this time. Certainly not lusterwares. And that's because of the Mongols. So this is 1221. This big red thing here is 1221. So I have told you in this lecture, and I told you in the last lecture, how the Mongols came in about 1221 or so, depending on which city you're talking about, and obliterated the city. So this happened a lot in Khorasan, it happened to Ray, it happened in lots of places. And how the Mongols deal with their border areas is basically to ride around them a lot and kill people, because they basically don't want people living in the areas around their central lands. They want basically this dead zone to surround them. And so Iran, a dead zone would be probably an exaggeration, but it was along those lines. It was somewhere where you don't really want to spend a lot of money on lusterwares. You never know when the Mongols might come back. And so looking at not just the dated pieces, which there's a lot, and then the end. And there's a couple. There are more tiles, but these are people investing in their graves, so they're probably hoping they're going to stay there for a while. They're not like buying it for dinner parties. But even there, they become more common after the Ilkhanid conquest, when an actual Mongol dynasty took over Iran. And so the Ilkhanids came in about 1260, and it was a big production. They came, they saw, they built roads and bridges, and basically turned Iran into a civilized country again. And they messed up instead Iraq and eastern Syria, which then became like the dead zone. Destroyed Raqqa, for instance, 1250. That was the end of Raqqa. And so then after that, they started making pottery again. And so the Luster potters knew how to make pottery because they remembered, even though it's like years. They had made some, but, they remembered the recipes, they remembered how to do it, and they started making pottery again, particularly the tiles, it seems, but also the vessels. And so it seems then that I didn't recognize there was a group here because of the lack of actual examples. When you find the occasional piece that belongs in here, you can see, there's a style in between this group and this group, more closely related to this group, that if they were making pottery in larger amounts, would be its own group. And so I called this Group X. An example of what I was saying when we talk about the Fatimids, about the idea that it may be that gaps in production are what define distinct groups, because this would be a gap in production. And whereas before this, you had this long period of Seljuk and post-Seljuk peace, in many ways, then you had this Iran becoming a killing zone, and then you had this long period of Ilkhanid peace. And so, where if there was a war, it would be on the western borders with Egypt and Syria and that sort of thing. So that would actually kind of support the idea that in some cases the styles, these groups of styles, are defined by gaps in production more than a sudden change in style. And we even see that in some of these where I've shown you examples that are like right in the cusp between otherwise well-defined groups. So this production would be continuous, then you'd have mostly a gap, and then you'd have continuous production again. So that's it for lusterwares and Minai and associated stone paste bodied wares from Iran. Thank you.